breaks. And
we'll get Alfie to connect you right now.
Okay, great. So I did want to talk just a little bit about the company that I work for before we get started with the program itself. So if you are still trying to wrap up last minute installation, or if you're on the phone with tech support, anything like that, you do have just a few minutes before we hit the ground running with the program. So everybody have training manuals? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Like I said, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the company that I work for. I work for Argus, and our headquarters are out of Houston, Texas. So that's my home base, and that's where I'm visiting from. I'm sure you could imagine the airport was insane this morning trying to get out with the Super Bowl crowd, but I made it. We are owned by the Altus Group, and they're based out of Toronto, Canada. So we have a few employees up in Toronto. Most of us are in Houston. We also have New York and New Jersey offices, and then regional offices in London, Sydney, and in Singapore. So we have three main solutions right now. And let me move this. Sorry. This might. There we go. We have three main solutions right now. So we have Argus Enterprise, which we're going to be covering today, and as many of you may already know, Argus Enterprise is designed to model your cash flows and valuations for your stabilized income-producing assets. So if you are coming from the older DCF program, this is the next step in the line. We also have Argus Developer. Anybody here heard of or used Developer before? Okay, a couple of people have heard of Developer. Okay, so Developer is designed for your vertical construction projects. If you're starting with a blank slate piece of land and building from the ground up, that's what we use Developer for. And then Voyanta is our most recently acquired cloud-based solution. It allows you to take all of that information from Argus Enterprise or Developer, pull it out of your system, send it into their online forms, and get more comprehensive reporting and analytics on your information. So we have all of these different training offerings. You guys are lucky enough to be in what we essentially call a private class. So when we have these university classes, we call them private classes, which means we get to focus on your questions. So if anything comes up while we're talking, please ask me. That's what I'm here for. I want to make sure that you feel comfortable and that you are leaving with a skill set here instead of just a big question mark over your head when it comes to Argus Enterprise. Now let me ask, anybody in here interested in or going to take the certification exam? Okay, so we're all taking certification. I will point out certification items as we work. I'll also take some time to talk about the exam, what it looks like, feels like, how you have to take it, that sort of thing, to make sure you guys feel as comfortable as possible with it. So this is a smattering of our client list. It is not at all comprehensive. And then you can see we also have our university program. I know we need an FIU up here. But you guys symbolize, and this is what I tell people when I go to client offices. I tell them we're teaching Argus Enterprise in the classroom now. So you guys are coming out with the enterprise skill set and ready to work. This is going to be our agenda. Now it says morning and afternoon, but kind of work with me there, right? This is like our morning session, sort of. So this afternoon, we will start with the basics of the program, how to move around within Argus Enterprise, what we call everything, and that will be important because I'll keep referring back to those things. We start with the basics. We will build a single tenant building to start with, and from there we'll build. So a little bit later on this evening, we will start talking about escalating your tenants' rents after we get that single tenant building in place. We'll talk about retail tenants who pay percentage rent. We'll get into the general vacancy calculation. Tomorrow we'll really focus on recovery. So if your building has expenses, how are your tenants paying you for those expenses? That's what we'll kick off with tomorrow afternoon. And then by tomorrow evening, we'll be talking about portfolio level functionality. If that means nothing to you right now, it will mean so much more tomorrow. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to go ahead and open up my Argus Enterprise program. And I'll actually open my email as well. So your Argus Enterprise program should look similar to mine. Now, I probably have a lot of information on the top half of my screen that you don't have, but that's okay. That just means I'm using my program. Let me hide this. There we go. So email open, and should be connecting to the internet soon, I think, for our online attendees. So this is your main screen of the program, and we're about to get into it, but I will point out that I am going to be using my training manual as a guide for our session over the next 2 days. Now, I'm not reading this manual to you. One, that would be super boring, but two, there's just way too much in here for me to cover in detail. So there are several instances where I will say this is a reference page for you. That means there's a lot more detail here than I have time to get into. So feel free to write in these, make notes, dog ear, whatever helps you out. I'm going to go ahead and open my training manual up, and I'm turning over to page 5. And page 5 is the first of your reference pages. It talks about how to get help when you need it. Now, I know many of you may have worked with the technical support team to get your installation up and running, but we've got a lot of resources other than the phone, so I want to make sure that you feel comfortable moving forward. Now, first of all, within the program itself, let's say you're working in the program and you've got a question about what the program is asking you to enter or what calculation is occurring in some instances. You have on-screen help that is available at any time from any window as long as your Argus Enterprise is up and running. So I can hit my F1 key, and F1 is going to launch my on-screen help, and that's the first thing page 5 tells you about. Off to the left-hand side, it has your table of contents, your index, your search, so however you like to find information, you've got a resource there. But when you hit F1, it gives you help information about the screen you're currently viewing. So I happen to have just opened my program up. I'm looking at my portfolios right now, and I get help information about portfolios. Now, I know sometimes, especially if you're working on a Mac, or in some cases, your function keys just don't automatically launch that on-screen help. So if that is the case, if F1 is not launching your on-screen help, you do still get on-screen help. Don't worry, it doesn't mean you don't get it at all. In the top right hand, use your right hand, top right-hand corner of your screen, you have a question mark icon, and when you click on that question mark icon, it gives you a drop-down menu. So you've got the table of contents and the index again. You select either one, and you get the on-screen help. So as I mentioned, it's got a lot of good information for you. Doesn't always answer all of your questions. So we do have the technical support information on page 5. You've got the phone number provided, which I gave to you over email. We also have some online features like chat and email. But for any of you, and I'll ask, I'll pick on somebody who did call technical support. When you call, what's the very first thing they ask you for, Ross?
Your product key.
Yeah, exactly. The first thing they want to know is what is your license or your product key. And that is something that you can find within your program, and especially as you guys move forward, you get into corporate environments, your license will be specific to the company that you're working for, and that technical support, it comes at no extra charge. So you want to know where that is so you can use it pronto. So within your program, as long as you can launch AE, on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm moving all the way down to the Help tab. And on the Help tab, I can see all of your help options, also what we discussed on page 5. You have the version information and then your license info. So if you do call technical support or reach out to them any way that you see on page 5, they are looking for the serial number, and that is specific to your installation of the program. Okay? So you might want to make a note to yourself, technical support equals a license, and you can find it on the Help tab. I'm going to move back up to my Property Portfolios tab on the navigation pane. And I do encourage you guys, and I mentioned this once already, but as you have questions, please ask. That is why I'm here. And I also will stop periodically and make sure you guys are still awake. I know it's going to be late tonight when we wrap up. So if somebody could give me like a thumbs up or a head nod, just let me know, yep, we're still with you, so we can keep cruising through this material, okay? There we go.
When are the breaks?
So we'll take...
No, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't.
Sure. Yeah, so we're going to take breaks in about an hour and a half, and then we'll do an hour for dinner, at 6, and then we'll come back in the evening, and we'll take another 15-minute break or so after we've been talking for about an hour and a half. Yeah?
Before we keep moving forward, onto the property portfolios, my tabs are like clustered, like they overlap one another. Is there any way of like elongating that so that I can see it more clearly?
That's actually a great question. It's come up a couple of times already. So Argus Enterprise is going to be driven by your screen resolution for the computer. So the only way to make those adjustments would be to close the program, adjust your screen resolution, and reopen it. And even then, that's not always a guarantee. So you can give it a shot, but my hope is that, as we're going through this, you'll be able to see everything clearly on my screen. So even if the words are cut off and it's, a little bit annoying right now during class, you should still be able to move around. And then technical support may have other options if you can give them a call if it's really bothering you. Okay?
Thank you.
Sure thing. So let's go ahead and turn over to page 7. And that's getting us into the program. So this is your main screen when you launch Argus Enterprise. And there are a few things that we want to talk about right off the bat with Argus Enterprise. One, and something you probably all had to deal with, Argus Enterprise is a database-driven system. And that's not going to come into play in a big way during our training class, but it is something that we want to be aware of because it's going to affect where our files are saved, how we can access them, that sort of thing. So like I said, Argus Enterprise, a database-driven system, which means that is where all our files are saved to, the Argus Enterprise database. And the only way to see our files is to open up the program. So I cannot navigate to, a drive through my Windows Explorer, find my C drive, find my Argus folder, and open up all my Argus Enterprise files. I can't do that. I have to have the program open. That is also going to impact how I can access files I receive from other users. So during our training, we're going to be creating everything from scratch within the system. However, if I were to receive a file via email from someone, that's come from an external source, something I didn't create within the system, I have to go through an import process to get that into my database. I also have to go through an export process if I need to get my files out and send them to somebody via email. So we'll get into all of that, but just saying right off the bat, when you guys went through the installation process for the program, you set up your database, which is where all of your files are going to be stored, okay? The other thing to note about Argus Enterprise is right off the bat, the very first thing you see is property portfolios, and that's because we start with portfolios within this system. You can really think of portfolios as an organizational folder, just a folder structure, really. It's all up to, who you end up working for, what team you end up working for, what sort of thing you end up doing, how you decide to use portfolios. So I have seen portfolios organized by fund, by deal, by team. I have seen small shops that don't really need a lot of portfolio functionality, which would include consolidated reporting and sensitivity. And so if they don't need that portfolio functionality, they will have one portfolio that has everything inside it, all of their single assets, or they'll have a 1-to-1 ratio where one portfolio has one asset inside. It just depends on what it looks like or how it works for each company or each individual. So we've got our existing portfolios on the top half of the screen here, and if you don't have any, that's okay, because like I said, we're creating everything from scratch. As you start adding portfolios to your system, you'll see them listed on the top half of your main screen of the program, and the bottom half of the screen has all of the properties within the selected portfolio. So you'll notice as I click through different portfolios on the top of my screen, the properties on the bottom half are updating in real time. So I am getting to see immediately what lives in every portfolio without having to actually open the portfolio up to go in and see what properties are inside. So we get a little bit of transparency there. You also have all of your portfolio level functionality listed right on this main screen. We can do things like open, create, duplicate, and delete. We've got all of the functionality listed. So we will come back here. I'll point out that page 8 is a reference page for you, and it is going to take you through and define every single one of your navigation pane options. And that navigation pane is running along the left-hand side of the screen. So for the most part, we are not getting into many of these tabs that you see. You do need to know that they exist and what their basic functionality is, especially when it comes to the exam. You have to know, yes, that exists, and basically what it does, but we're not getting into the details of what these things do within our training. What I do want to point out, we've already talked about help, so that's going to be an important one for you. I do want to move down to the control panel. So the very last tab on your navigation pane, moving into the control panel, which is on page 9. Now, most of the time, this part of the program is pretty locked down. And that is because when you are working in a team environment, typically you are working on what we call a shared license. And in a shared license setting, usually only 1 or 2 people have access to the control panel. It sets up the user roles, the security settings, and the permissions for the system. So you can say who gets access to touch what here. We all have access to this part of the program now because we are each individual administrators on our individual installations of the program here. So we get to see all of this. Now, we don't necessarily have to do a lot here because we don't have to secure anything from anyone else. We're the only users. But what I will point out here are your workspace settings. And we'll come back here again a couple of times. But for now, I want to point out the workspace settings down at the bottom of this window. And within Workspace, you have some settings that you can configure for your personal use of the program. And a few of these I want to point out. Now, I'll mention page 10 takes you through all of these, but some of these that I want to point out to you are down at the bottom of this window. So you have something called Scenario, Open Last Scenario. And I would imagine that for most of you, this is Open Last Scenario is set to on. Am I right? Yeah. And that's okay. That's the default setting. When you have Open Last Scenario set to on, that means when you double-click on the desktop icon for Argus Enterprise, it is going to launch and launch with the last thing you were working on. And that's really convenient for a lot of people. Now, it doesn't really work well for me because I do a new training every week, so I want a fresh view of the program every time I open it. But if you're happy seeing the last thing you were working on when you launch the program, you can leave that set to on. Otherwise, if you want to see just that main screen, you can toggle this to off like I have. Beneath Scenario, you are going to see something called autosave. And that is a lie. I think these are not the words we want to use here. Argus Enterprise is not an autosave program. So do not think at any point that it is automatically saving what you are working on. It is not. And that's probably an exam question. It is not an autosave program. But what this is, and I think this really could be relabeled to say something more like auto recover, because what this does is automatically save and then continually behind the scenes save an auto recover file for you, which is available only if your system crashes or your program or your computer fails, so something like that, that auto recover file becomes available. So you can put your own setting in place. You'll see I have a personal setting for it to save every 5 minutes. You guys will probably notice the first time it does the autosave and then not again. It goes completely behind the scenes. We can really think of Argus Enterprise like we do any Microsoft product. So anytime you're working in Word, PowerPoint, Excel, save as we work. But if if something really bad happens, then there is an auto recover file for us. Now, the very last thing you have here is auto edit property, and mine is set to on. That's the default setting, and I like leaving that setting in place, which means when I open up my single asset and I'm ready to work, my file is immediately ready to be edited. So I don't have to press any extra buttons. So I'm not going to change anything here. If you have updated any of your settings, you can hit OK, but I will close this window. And we're going to move on to page 11, where we are creating a new portfolio. So you can see right there. Now, if at any time you have any trouble seeing what's up on my screens, that's why I keep calling out these page numbers, because you'll notice, again, I'm not reading this to you guys. So it goes into a little bit more detail in some cases. But if you ever have trouble seeing my screen, we've got screenshots on almost every single page here. So I'm moving back up the navigation pane to the Property Portfolios tab, and we're going to be creating our own portfolio together. So I'm going to use my Create New Portfolio icon and turn over to page 12. Now, we get this window that pops up, and it says, what do you want to name your portfolio? So I'm going to call this my FIU Training. And you'll want to hit Tab past these cells that don't touch each other. So you tab through the cells that don't touch each other here. I am going to mouse click down on the description, and your description is not required information. You never have to include a description. But if it helps you, I always like to include the month and the year when I have my training. So I'm going to have February 2017 here, but you don't have to have anything. Beneath the description, you will see a drop-down menu for Chart of Accounts. And a chart of accounts within Argus Enterprise is going to be a listing of revenue and expense line items, and they all have account numbers associated. Chart of accounts is never required when you're using Argus Enterprise, but if it is something that you're going to use, if you're a budget user, maybe you need to consolidate and look at actuals over multiple properties over a long period of time, you can use those account numbers for all of your revenues and expenses to track those more closely across multiple properties. We are not going to use a chart of accounts until tomorrow. And so I'll be sending you guys an email tomorrow during the day with a couple of Excel files that we'll be using in the afternoon session. One of those will be a chart of accounts so you can see what it looks like, what it feels like, how that can be used within Argus Enterprise. We're not going to set that up right now, so we're just going to move past that drop-down. I then have an assigned user drop-down menu. This is not going to come into play for our training. The assigned user field is available if you have a shared license. So multiple people all reading the same information, all sharing a license together, and they can assign users out to specific portfolios. So we're going to move past that. It won't bother us today. The last thing you see is a checkbox for Is Template. And if you find that really what your work is creating things from scratch over and over again, but you know every time you create a file from scratch, your TIs, your LCs will be your tenant improvements and leasing commissions will be the same. Maybe your inflation rates every time will be that you've got a management fee in there, and you know every time you start you've got to get those in. If you check this box for Is Template, it allows this portfolio and any properties within it to be template files or a base set of assumptions. So when you do go to build from scratch, you have those templates in place with those few items already set up for you, so you can build off of that. Now, we are not going to create templates in our training, so please do not check that box. And the reason that I stress do not check it is because when you check that box, it limits the portfolio level functionality you have access to. And we need to be able to touch all of that throughout our training. So we need all of the portfolio stuff. We're not going to be setting up templates here. Are there any questions about what we've covered so far before we hit OK and create our portfolio? All right. In that case, I'll hit OK at the bottom of this window. And I'll turn over to page 13, where we see our portfolio navigation interface. And I know this piece is kind of slow, talking about everything and setting it up, but we have to know what all of this is so we can keep referring back to it. So now we have this new view of the program, and I want to talk about it starting at the top and working my way down. Once we covered this screen, we're going to create a property entirely from scratch and start getting through our inputs. So top left-hand corner of the screen, you have a series of 4 viewing tabs: File, Home, View, Audit. Your File tab will always be highlighted in yellow, and if you click on File, it takes you back to the main screen of the program. So File is going to give you access to all of your portfolios, all of your functionality within the program. Our portfolio that we created has already opened, and when it opened to the Home Viewing tab. Home is where you can view all of your open assets. And the nice thing about Argus Enterprise is that you can view multiple assets simultaneously. So we can open up lots of portfolios and lots of properties and see them all on this Home Viewing tab. You've also got View and Audit tabs. And we'll come back and talk about View and Audit a little bit later. Audit we'll get into tomorrow evening. The View tab is going to allow us to create customized views, which we will practice doing very shortly. And we'll talk about why you might want to create a custom view and what that would mean for you. Beneath our viewing tabs, we have a ribbon that runs along the top of the screen, and that contains all of our functionality for an open portfolio. When we get a property open, that ribbon will still remain at the top of our screen, but it will update to have functionality specific to an open property. Underneath the ribbon, running along the left-hand side of the screen, we have the navigator, and this is where we see everything that we have open. So what you've opened has a named tab in the navigator. So right now I only have one open portfolio. And then taking up the bulk of our screen here, this large white area, this is our property list. So as we add properties to the portfolio, they get listed here with some very basic details. Down at the bottom of the screen, I have a series of what we call portfolio application tabs, and we're going to cover these, but that's enough, I think, of me talking at you about this stuff. So if you are just dying to know right now, what are portfolio application tabs? Turn over to page 14. You've got a reference page there that defines them all. But like I said, we're going to come back and use these, so we will talk about them as we use them. What we're going to do is hop over to page 15 and create a new property together. So you have 3 different ways that you can create a property from scratch. You have an Add Property button in the Home ribbon. I told you I'd come back and talk about these things and use their names. So Add Property button in the Home ribbon. You can also come down to the property list and right-click to add a property. Or if you like hotkeys or shortcut keys, the hotkey is Control-N. And I'll just take this moment to mention, if anybody is a serious hotkeys user, starting on page 279 at the back of your manual, you have all I will point out that our case study we're working on has a theme, gold star to the person who can guess it, but our property name is going to start with Humperdinck Plaza. And again, I'm tabbing through these cells that don't touch each other. The external ID is not a required field, and in fact it is a field that I'm not using in our training. But the external ID allows you to establish this file as unique within your Argus Enterprise database. If you do not create an external ID, your Argus Enterprise database creates one for you, which is why it's not required, because the system will populate it if you don't come up with one. However, if you find that the external ID ends up being a field you touch a lot, maybe you work with the back end of the system, or you end up using our Excel add-in, which does talk to the database and uses this external ID. For our clients that do that, usually they come up with a naming convention for the external ID. So this can be anything you want it to be if you want to use this, but again, not required, so I'll skip past it. Then we see the label. A label is your own personal classification. You can only have one label at a time, and it just resides within your system. I'm going to move down to the Analysis Begin field, and you can see that it's defaulting to the current month and year. Your Analysis Begin date is the date at which all of your calculations start occurring, and this is also the purchase date for the property, which we'll see a little bit later this afternoon. Our Analysis Begin date will be January of 2018. So you do have a drop-down calendar, and you can navigate to January of 2018, or you can highlight the month and use your J key to get to January, and then space bar or arrow key over and type in 2018 and tab off that field. The next thing we see are analysis years and months. So this is the length of your hold period. You can enter up to 100 years for length of analysis, but we're not going to get that crazy today. We're going to keep it simple for our training and just look at a 5-year hold period. I'll move down to the address, which is not required information, but we'll enter it so that you can see where an address populates within your system if you decide to include it. So the address that we are using is on page 16. This is actually our Houston headquarters address, so you can mail me a postcard. 750 Town and Country Boulevard. And our city is Houston. We'll be in the state of Texas. When you get down to the country, this is a drop-down list, so you can either scroll and find United States, or if you start typing, it will automatically populate. And then I'll use the zip code 77024. The comments is a free-form field that you can enter, so just whatever miscellaneous comments you might have. You'll see, again, a drop-down menu to change the property type. And then the last thing we have is a checkbox that is automatically checked for us, and this is really for your convenience. So as long as you leave that check mark in place, open the property in the editor, when you hit finish, or if you hit your enter key, your property gets created and it opens up ready for changes to be made. If you uncheck this box for any reason, and you very well may find a time that you would want to, but if you uncheck that box, the property does still get created. However, it is listed within the property list of your open portfolio. So then if you wanted to make changes, you would have to double click on that file to open it up and start making those changes. We'll go ahead and hit finish and let our property be created. And as that is working, I will point out that at the end of every chapter, you have chapter review questions. Now, we are not going over those chapter reviews together, but they are really great practice for the exam. So I just wanted to highlight that. You've got your first chapter review on page 17. We are cruising through this material, so we're going to turn over to page 19, where we are looking at our property level user interface. And so everybody should see something similar to what's in your manual and what's on my screen. Yes? Is there a question over here? No? Yes? No? Maybe not? All good?
I'm not sure where you're at, because my computer was like super slow, so it was like, it was still like loading when you like, I was up there.
Okay.
You said finish, Barbara.
Huh?
You said finish.
Yeah, all I did was hit finish, so now we all see the same thing. Yes?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So this is page 19, right? And this is your property level user interface. So we've gone first through the main screen of the program. Then we looked at the open portfolio view. Now we are looking at an open property. So 3 different levels that we've gone through. I'll also point out your navigator is still open. It has a named tab for your open property. It also has a named tab for your open portfolio. So if I click on the named tab for my open portfolio, I get back to that portfolio view. that has not automatically closed my property. Because it is still a named tab on the navigator, it is still open and active. So I can click on the named tab, Humperdinck Plaza, and I get right back to that open property view, okay? So the only way to close things from the navigator are to click the X or cross that you see next to the named tab within the navigator. Now, in my opinion, this is a really busy view. There's a lot happening here. I've got, stuff in every direction. So I'm going to start streamlining what I see. Question?
I'm now getting a message from somebody online that saying that they're not able to access the screen. Is it to confirm that it's on live?
I don't know anything about that.
What is the question?
She said that they're not getting the stream. She said she got a message from somebody online. They're not able to access the stream.
Yeah, I have a message from somebody online saying that the live stream's not working.
Okay, I will check into that. But usually the fix for that is rebooting. If it's a problem for everybody, then that will not work. But in many cases, they're just rebooting and the stream should work. But
Okay.
I'm going to check into that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. So like I was saying, I like to streamline things here because, there's a lot going on and we want to be really, focused on what we're talking about here. So I'm going to take away the navigator. I don't need to see that right now. And I can pin it to the left-hand side of the screen. That way I get a little bit more room on my main screen of the program. So there is a caret at the top of the navigator that I can use. And that pins the navigator to the left-hand side of the screen, displaying the title of the asset I'm currently viewing. If I ever need to get that task pane open again, that navigator open again, I can use the very same caret to expand, and I get all of those labels back. So for now, I'll hide that piece of the program. I'm still left with a split screen view. On the top half of my window, I have all of the reports within Argus Enterprise, and on the bottom half of the screen, I have all of my inputs. About halfway in the middle of the screen, I have a splitter. So if you like this split screen view, you can leave it in place and just drag that splitter up to see more inputs or drag it down to see more reports. Now, I really like to view just one or the other, just inputs or just reports, especially when we're in these training classes so you can see everything that's available on my screen. But the reason that so many people do like the split screen view is because your reports are updating in real time as we work. So as soon as we make changes to the inputs, our reports are automatically calculating. That is because in your home ribbon, your calculation is set to automatic. And this is a setting you can change. You can toggle that to off, which means that then your reports will not calculate or update again until you toggle the calculation back to automatic. So we've talked about how you have the splitter. You can drag up or down to see more inputs or reports. You also have a show hide section within the home ribbon. And right now, inputs and reports are both active. They're both highlighted yellow. That tells me I can see both of these items. If you ever get to work on a dual monitor setup, what I really like to do is use the report dock feature. And the report dock will pull my reports into a separate window. So it's accessible through the show hide section of the home ribbon. If I click on report dock, my reports are now in a separate window. So if I am working on two monitors, I can drag the reports over to the second monitor and view inputs and reports full screen, side by side, updating in real time. And for our clients, this was a big value add. So this is really changing the way people are working with the Argus systems. When you have completed using the report dock, you can either use the pushpin dock to get back to a split screen view, or you can close them all together, which is what I'll do now. I'll close the reports, and I'm looking just at the inputs. Also, in my home ribbon, only the input button is highlighted, so it's showing me that's the only thing that's active right now. So you can use that show hide section if you want to look at reports next. You can toggle reports on to get the split screen and then turn inputs off. Or you can turn the inputs off right now. You're viewing inputs, but you can turn them off, and that takes you into the reporting screen, full view. That has also taken you out to a fifth viewing tab specific to reports. So we have all of our report functionality in the report ribbon at the top of the screen. If you are using those show hide buttons to toggle between inputs and reports, then you would have to go back to that home viewing tab in order to access the show hide buttons. So I don't really like going back to that show hide section all the time. This is where I like to use hotkeys, and so if your hotkeys are working, you can use F4 to get to your input screen, and F3 to view reports. So I want to make sure I'm focused on the inputs right now. I've talked about all of the different ways you can get to inputs. I will use my F4 key, and that's what I'll call out for the remainder of class because I know those are tricky to remember, okay, which one does which? But if you are not using those, don't get frustrated. Remember that you have those show hide buttons to toggle, or you can use the splitter to move through the screens.
I'm sorry, so F4 is for
Inputs,
inputs here.
and F3 for reports.
Okay.
The last thing I will point out about our home ribbon is the Save Property button. So looks like a floppy disk. That's our universal symbol to save, and that's what we will use to save our property as we work. Yeah?
Would you mind saying the S3, S4?
Sure thing. So F4 should get you inputs full screen.
Sorry, the opposite.
I don't know how that happened.
You also.
And F3 for reports.
Then it is your CSFM.
I will point out that page 20 is a reference page for you that takes you through how the home ribbon has updated on a property level. And as I mentioned, it would be different between a portfolio and a property. So page 20 showing you how those have updated. I'm going to move on to page 21, and we're focused on our property parent tab and description sub-tab. And the reason I distinguish between the two is because on both inputs and reports, you have two rows of tabs. Your parent tabs are the top level of tabs, and each has an icon next to it. Every parent tab has its own set of sub-tabs. So as I mentioned, we're on the property parent tab and looking at the description sub-tab to start with, which is where we can change or update basic descriptive information about our property. You can change the property name, the external ID, include labels. This is where you can come to change your asset type at any time. You can change the analysis begin date and length of the analysis. And what we are going to do is enter a building area on this screen. This is where we will enter our net rentable area for the property. This is what we'll have 60,000 square feet for our building area. And our occupancy will be based off of this entry. The bottom of page 21 gives you explanations of every single sub-tab here. And I'm going to highlight just a couple more of these so that you're aware. We'll come back and use some of them, but I'll point out the location sub-tab is going to have the address if you included one. And the area measures sub-tab has pulled through our building area measure that we entered back on the description sub-tab. So if you have any customized building area measures, this is where you can come to enter them. And we actually will create a custom area measure tomorrow when we get into our recoveries, okay? We'll turn over to page 22. And within our program, we're going to move to the Market Parent tab. And we'll focus on the Inflation sub-tab for now. So by default, within Argus Enterprise, your inflation rates are going to apply annually according to the timing of your model and start in year 2 of the analysis. We can see that here on our inflation table. Year 1 of our analysis is grayed out. So our inflation beginning in year 2 of the analysis. Down at the bottom of the screen, your inflation month is, there's that default setting, tied to the analysis date. But if you have monthly inflation, or if you want your inflation to occur at some time other than the analysis date, you can select from the month of the year here. I'll leave that default setting in place. I'll also point out your recovery timing options. The recovery timing is referring to your recoveries. That is, the reimbursements of your expenses. So this is the annual basis on which you are receiving reimbursement of your expenses and when those reimbursements are inflating. You've got 3 options in this drop-down menu. Fiscal recovery using fiscal inflation, calendar recovery using fiscal inflation, and a calendar setting. Your fiscal year is tied to the timing of your model. So if your analysis begins in June, then your fiscal year is June to the following May, and that's the fiscal year on which you'll receive the reimbursements. Or inflation in the first 2 options. Your calendar year will always be January to December. Now in our example, because we started the analysis in January, it really doesn't matter which of these we choose because our fiscal year and our calendar year will be the same. So the book tells us to select our calendar setting. And now we can move up to our table. We've got 5 default categories here, and I cannot change any of their names. No inflation will always be 0%. So you'll notice, I don't know if it's easy to tell up here, but at least on your screen it should be very easy to tell. This is grayed out, so you cannot make a change here. What we can update are the inflation rates that are provided. Now you can't change the names for these 5 default categories, but if you have a custom inflation rate, you can add to this list. So notice that you have an add record button in the home ribbon. So this allows you to add lines to the screen and you can add in your custom inflation rates. We are starting with the basics though. So we'll get a general inflation rate in first, which will be 3% across all years. All I have to do is enter 3 in general inflation for 2019 and hit enter. And that has automatically extended the 3% out across all years. Now my market inflation rate is going to be 5% in 2019 and 2020, decreasing to 3% in the remaining years of my analysis. So I need to type all of that in here. I'll start with 5% in 2019, and now I am tabbing across over to 2021, and I want to overwrite with 3% here, and hit enter so that I see 55333. The last thing to note is that our expense inflation rate will be 3% across all years. So in our expense inflation rate, we'll get 3% and hit enter. We will come back and deal with CPI after we get back from our lunch/dinner break. So for now, we're going to leave that line blank, but we'll come back and talk about that as well. Are there any questions on the inflation sub-tab?
Yeah.
Yes.
On the inflation tab, I'm noticing on my neighbors that they're getting more clear like from December 2018 to 2023. And it goes as far as to 2028.
So that has to do with the length of your analysis. And I'm going to kind of repeat questions so that if anybody has a similar question, then that gets resolved as well. But the question was, hey, I'm noticing that instead of stopping at 2023, I go all the way out to 2028, you said, right? So if you notice that you've got a lot more years here than I do, this is encompassing the length of your analysis. And when we set up the property, we said this is going to have a 5-year analysis. So if you need to update the length of the analysis, you'll go back to the Property Parent tab, Description sub-tab, and make sure that the length of your analysis is 5 years. Okay?
So is the Property Parent tab and then the... Oh, no.
Good? Okay. All right. Any other questions about inflation for now? All right. Fantastic. Then we'll turn over to page 23, and we're going to start building this file out even more. So page 23 takes us into revenues. I'll move to the Revenues Parent tab. And we'll be using the miscellaneous subtab for our training, but you do see parking and storage subtabs as well. So if you are looking to break down your revenue items even further, you certainly can do so. The miscellaneous subtab is where we enter all of our non-tenant driven revenue items. So if we have vending or laundry, or in this case what we'll have is a roof antenna. Now I need to get my roof antenna into this miscellaneous revenues screen, but in order to enter the information I have to add a line item and then populate the line. So I need to start by adding a record, and I can do that one of three ways. I have an add record button in the home ribbon, or I can come down to the white space, right click, and add a record. Or you can use the hotkey Control N. Any one of those three ways will add a line item here. So I am going to use my add record button to start. I get a line that populates on miscellaneous revenues. The first few columns that I see are going to be related to having a chart of accounts applied to the file, which we do not have at this point. So we're going to move past those first few columns over to the name column. Where it says enter item name, this is where we start entering the information for our revenue that we see on page 23. So we see we've got a roof antenna with a projected annual amount of $12,000 in year one. The revenue item is going to inflate at our general inflation rate of 3%, and it will be 100% fixed. I start with enter item name. This is where I type roof antenna. And I'm going to tab across through these cells. The next thing I see is my how input column. And the how input column is asking, how do I want to value or calculate this revenue item? You have a lengthy list here. We won't get to all of them. We're going to try and cover as many as we can, though. I'll point out that page 24 is a reference page for you that defines all of those how input options.
Just how did you add that input? I didn't see that.
You've got three different ways to do that. You've got an add record button in the home ribbon. You can right-click an add record or Control N. We're going to start with using the how input, amount 1. Oh, I need you to, did you sign for that? Okay, great. And when we use the how input, amount 1, that says I know what the value of this revenue is, and I'm going to type it in the amount 1 column. So amount 1 is where we now enter 12,000. And we leave the frequency set to annually. Your only other option here is monthly. The other thing I see is that this item is 100% fixed, and that's the default setting. That means this is a guaranteed revenue item. If instead of 100% fixed, I saw this cell entered as 0% fixed, that means the revenue item would fluctuate entirely based on the occupancy of our building. So we're going to talk about the formula that we use to calculate fixed percentages when we get to our expenses screen. So hold that thought, hold your burning questions. We're going to cover just a few more items on miscellaneous revenues before we get there. Now next to your fixed percentage column, you have applied attendance and timing. And I bring this up to say we are not touching these fields in our training. Applied attendance and timing are not designed to be used with discounted cash flow valuations. They are designed to be used within the UK, where this applied attendance and timing is used to trigger revenues or expenses. So Argus Enterprise, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, but Argus Enterprise actually contains the valuation methods used here in the Americas, our discounted cash flow methodology. That's what we're used to performing. It also contains traditional valuation, which is used primarily in the UK, and it's just a different way of valuing your properties. And then we have a third valuation method that's used primarily in Australia, and that's capitalization valuation. So you will have some extra areas for input here that don't necessarily have to do with the valuation you're performing. And this applied attendance and timing are fields like that. They are not designed to be used with properties being valued in North America, so we are not going to change those settings here. And I'll point this out again when we get to expenses, because I think people touch these without realizing what they do, and it can have some counterintuitive effects. So just, that's my first warning. You'll get one more with that, and so I'll talk a little bit more about what applied attendance and timing will do when we get into expenses. For now, I am moving past those items, and when you move past applied attendance and timing, you will see your inflation column. Your general inflation rate is applying by default to your revenue items. So what you can also do is hit the drop-down menu and select from any of the inflation rates that you've populated within that inflation table we just set up. And when we get into expenses, we'll talk about how you can create custom inflation rates on the spot as well. Now, before we do move into expenses, are there any questions about revenues? Feeling good? Okay. All right. In that case, we will move to the Expenses Parent tab, and we'll focus on the Operating sub-tab here. I've turned over to page 25 within the training manual. Within this Operating sub-tab, this is where we can enter all of our reimbursable and non-reimbursable expenses. So we'll talk about how to indicate here whether an item is eligible for reimbursement by the tenants or not. We are going to go through a total of 4 examples for our operating expenses, which is by no means comprehensive of what you would see in an actual property. Just keep in mind that as we go through these examples, they are exactly that, examples, designed to get you familiar with what the program is capable of and what calculations are occurring. So at no point am I trying to say, well, this is how you should all be entering your real estate taxes. That's not what I'm here to say at all. So these are just examples. And we're going to go through 4 examples. I'll start by adding 2 lines to this screen. Just like we saw on our revenues, you're getting those first few columns related to a chart of accounts. So I'm moving over to the name column. And we start with an insurance expense that has a projected annual amount of $60,000 every year. So I'll call this insurance. And I know what the value is. Now, when you get to the How Input drop-down menu, you've got all of the same options that we saw back on the revenue screen. So if you'll remember that page 24 is reference for you that defines all of those. The only difference between this expenses screen and the revenues drop-down menu will be the last 2 items on the list, Prop 13A and Prop 13B. These are tax provision items that are specific to California markets. So if you do not value properties in California, you would never have to touch this. If you do, then page 25 has definitions for both Prop 13A and B, and it takes you through the calculations for those items. In this case, we know what the value is. So we're using the How Input Amount 1. And we're moving over to the Amount 1 column to enter our $60,000. This is an annual expense, so we leave the frequency as is with the default setting. And then I'll scroll ever so slightly to point out it is by default 100% fixed. This is a guaranteed expense item. I will always see at least $60,000 on my cash flow for insurance. This item also defaults to 100% recoverable, which means the entire portion of this expense is eligible for reimbursement once we get tenants in the building. Okay? Now I'll move down to line 2, where we will have a utilities expense. And my utilities will be valued as 50 cents per rentable area per month. So I'm looking for the How Input, dollar per rentable area. You'll notice as soon as you select that How Input, the area measure column becomes active and by default picks up the building area measure. So if you did not enter a building area measure, you would not see a utilities expense when you get to the cash flow, right? I'll leave that area measure at the default, and I'll come back to the amount column to enter my 50 cents, and I want to be sure that I'm updating the frequency to a monthly setting. Now, the other thing to note about our utilities, and what I see at the bottom of page 25, is that utilities is 50% fixed. So we're moving to that fixed percentage column and typing in 50%. Question?
I don't know why it's already happened to me like 2 times that I'll input like the numbers on the amount and if I click enter, like the rows will split. Like,
Okay. It sounds like you probably have a sort in place, and so what you would need to do is go to a column header, like account number, and right-click, and clear all sorting.
okay.
And if that doesn't resolve the issue, okay. So fixed percentages. Oh, did you have a?
Yeah, can you explain why one is 100% fixed conceptually and the other one is 50% fixed, for example? Just so we can get the idea of...
So we're talking about fixed percentages now. And when we say that an item is less than 100% fixed, as I mentioned, this means that the either expense or revenue item is fluctuating based on the occupancy of our building. Now, what we typically see as less than 100% fixed or based on the occupancy of the building are things like water and electricity, which are utility items. So you know that you have to pay a certain amount in order to have electricity or water turned on and flowing to the building. But then, you know, if you don't really have many occupants, well, your electricity bill isn't that high. So it's a little bit lower when you don't have as many people in the building. But then your occupancy skyrockets, and now your electricity bill has gone up. So that's why we're having this item fluctuate based on the occupancy. And when I was kind of thinking about conceptualizing fixed percentages, I always thought of like a vending machine in like very simplistic terms, a vending machine. So if I have to rent a vending machine to have it in my building every month, I got to pay for it to be there, and then I pay to stock it separately. So there's a portion that is fixed, I have to pay to keep it there, and then a portion that varies. If everybody eats the Nutter Butters, well, I got to restock the Nutter Butters. But then, you know, I don't have many people in the building, and I can keep them all to myself, so I'm not having to pay that restock fee so often. So now so that is sort of the idea behind fixed percentages. I'll also say when we get into reimbursements, we're going to talk about gross ups, which is dealing with how much of an expense item that a tenant is reimbursing us for based on a higher occupancy rate. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. But for now, we have a formula when it comes to fixed percentages to determine how much we're going to see on the cash flow. So your formula is your fixed percentage times the full expense amount plus the full expense amount times the portion that varies times the occupancy of the building. And that gives you the expense pass-through.
So that was fixed percentage times the amount.
Full expense amount plus the full expense amount times the portion that varies times the occupancy of the building. And that formula is at the bottom of page 25 for you as well. Now, another thing that I'm going to be sharing with you guys in my follow-up email is this slide deck. And it has lots of calculation examples for you. We're going through all of these together, but they will be really helpful for you as you are, using the program and preparing for the certification exam. So here's your formula again. That full fixed amount times the fixed percentage plus the expense amount times the portion that varies times the occupancy of the building. So if we look at a very simple expense of $100,000 and we say that it is 50% fixed, we know at a minimum we will see $50,000 on the cash flow, and anything beyond that would depend on the occupancy of our building. Now let's look at our utilities that we just plugged in. We said it was 50 cents per rentable area of 60,000 square feet, and that was a monthly expense, so we multiplied times 12 to get our annual expense amount of $360,000. That's what we plug into our formula. 360 times 50% fixed plus 360 again times 50% variable. Whatever is not fixed is variable. Times the occupancy of the building where we don't have any tenants yet. We haven't built the file out. So we're at 0% occupancy. That means if we look at the cash flow right now, all we see when it comes to our utilities expense is $180,000. And the only way that we see closer to that 360 is when we get more tenants in the building, when we get closer to 100% occupied. Question?
This is like cement something. When it's under 100% fixed, it means that it's variable.
There's a portion that's variable. Yeah. So the fixed percentage you're entering is what will always be paid no matter what. And then whatever isn't fixed is the variable portion that fluctuates based on how occupied you are.
I just have another quick question about the fixed versus variable. Are there any other inputs that would be considered fixed automatically that, because like in here in the description, it obviously doesn't say that insurance is fixed. I mean, it says here that the utilities is variable. Are there any other ones that we should know about, that we should input, or?
Well, I mean, anything like that that you're putting within the system. Now, if you're going off of Argus materials, it will tell you, right? If you're thinking, well, if I'm preparing for the certification exam, it's going to tell you if an item is fixed or if there's a varying portion. Okay. But then when it comes to, real world stuff, that's something that would be figured out, when you're figuring out the terms of the building.
Okay.
I think your intuition is probably the best because you think about it, for example, insurance, you have to pay the same amount regardless whether nobody lives there or it's fully occupied, but something it really depends. So I think that's probably the best guide.
Sure. Does everybody feel okay about fixed percentages before we move on? All right. There we go. All right. So we've got that. Utilities, 50% fixed. I'm going to turn over to page 26, and we have a third expense item to get within the system. So I'll add a record. This time I'll use my right click to add a record. And what we have on page 26 is real estate taxes. And I'm tabbing over to the How input. Now I know what real estate taxes is. I know real estate taxes are an annual amount of $90,000. But I also know exactly when I pay my real estate taxes. I have to pay half in June and the other half in December. So I know what the value is. I want to use my How input, amount 1, but I also want to enter the specifics, when an item is starting, stopping, or occurring. And to do that, I go to the amount 1 column, ellipses, or 3 dots button. I'm going to call this the ellipses. And click on that ellipses. This now opens up a table. So I can say specifically in my analysis when I pay my real estate taxes. Now I'll point out to you that this table opens by default in copy across and down edit mode, which you can see at the top of the table. So if I don't pay attention to that and I just think, oh, I got to get my real estate taxes in, half in June, $45,000, and hit enter, it's done exactly that. It is copied across through the end of my analysis and down through the remaining months of the year. Now the nice thing is I have a reset amounts button at the bottom of my screen. So I can reset the amounts since I've opened the table. And what I'm going to do is move into single value edit mode that allows me to change one cell at a time. Now I'll find June and enter 45,000 and enter down to December, get the other half of my expense in. I've got an annual total of 90,000. If you like to type things, you can type through the rest of the table every June, every December, but I like to save time. So I can select any cell in this first column that I've edited and then go up to my top of my table and use my copy column to end button. I am using copy column to end here. And that will copy and paste my column through the end of the table exactly. At the bottom of the table, my inflation rate of 3% is applying, so the inflated annual total is what we actually see on the cash flow. Any questions here?
Mine is default to the expense, I just changed it.
On the expenses screen, it should be defaulting to the expense inflation rate.
Sorry, it had no inflation default, so I had to specifically put down, or should I do that?
So, like I said, on the expenses, you should be on the expenses parent tab, operating sub tab, and by default, it should be picking up the expense inflation rate.
But when I add general inflation, if I select it specifically, it does it.
Okay. I'll hit OK at the bottom of this table to save my changes, and now amount 1 reads vary. So that tells me that there's more detailed information entered behind the ellipses. I'll move on to my last expense item on page 27. So I need to add one more record, and this time I'm using my hotkey Control N for my management fee. And my management fee is going to be calculated as 3% of the effective gross revenue. So I'm using the HOW input, percent of effective gross revenue, and the amount interprets as a percentage. That's where I can enter my 3%. Now, the other thing to note about our management fee is that our tenants are not going to be required to reimburse us for this expense item. So that means I am moving over to the recoverable percentage column, and I am zeroing this out. So even when I get tenants in the building, they are not going to help me pay for that management fee. Now, if I keep scrolling just a little bit further, I'll point out, again, you see this apply to tenants and timing. We are leaving apply to tenants set to no here. And I'll point out, if your thinking is, oh yeah, well the tenants are going to help pay for this. So yes, this applies to all tenants. Notice that it is no longer recoverable at all, which is a problem, okay? So that is not going to work, I think, probably the way most people think it would. We are going to make sure apply to tenants just reads no for our training, okay? We'll keep moving past apply to tenants and timing. You have an inflation column. By default, everything is picking up the expense inflation rate. And then just beyond inflation, you have a limits section. And the limits section is referenced for you on the bottom of page 27. Limits allow you to set either floors or ceilings for your projected expense amounts. And keep in mind, we are still talking about expenses, not our reimbursements at this point. So if I need to say that my expense will at least hit a certain amount or it won't exceed a certain amount, I can put a limit in place. Okay? Well, oh, yeah.
That's as far as increases or as far as we can build a tenant?
So right now it's the expense itself.
Okay.
Right. On page 28, we're moving into our capital expenses. Now, I will point out that you have a non-operating sub-tab, which we're not using in our training. And the non-operating sub-tab, anything you enter here is not counted toward the value of your property. So what I typically see in non-operating expenses are things like legal fees. And I'll point out, I think on page 25, you actually have a key box about halfway down the middle of the page. And these key boxes are good to make note of. We pull exam questions from those key boxes. So that key box on the middle of page 25 just points out that your non-operating expenses are falling below your net operating income line on your cash flow, if you include any.
I think I did a mistake in putting the information on utilities. Is it fixed 100% and recoverable 50%, or the other way around?
Other way around.
Okay, thank you.
So on page 28, we're entering our capital expenses. So I'll move past non-operating over to the capital sub-tab. Your capital expenses are not considered part of the property's net operating income. They will fall below that income line on the cash flow. And these would be structural items, reserves, things like that. We will have two capital expenses for our training. So I'm going to add two records. And our first will be a capital reserve. We'll value the capital reserve at 10 cents per rentable area per year. So we're looking for dollar per rentable area as our HOW input. And then entering the amount 1, 10 cents, leaving the frequency set to annually. In line 2, we'll have a roof repair. And we'll say, we had a roofer come out. He said, nah, roof is doing okay. You really won't need to repair it until 2021. So I'll come out in May of 2021 and repair the roof. And I'll quote you $40,000. So I know exactly how much and exactly when that occurs. How do I want to enter that here?
The variable in the ellipsis.
Yeah, there you go. So you guys were on the right track. Once we enter something here, it will say varies, but we need to go into the ellipses. Now, what's the very first thing I want to do on this table? It's May of 2021. So how do I want to set up the table first?
Single value.
There we go, bingo. Single value edit mode. Now I can find May 2021 and enter my $40,000. I notice that by default my expense inflation rate is applying here. But we'll say this is why this guy is my roofer. He quoted me $40,000 in 2021 dollars. So good guy there. I don't want inflation to apply here. I have a couple of ways that I can change the inflation that is applying on this screen. So you can either come down to the inflation row at the bottom of the window and overwrite this with 0%. Or remember that you have no inflation from the inflation table. So bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you have a drop-down menu that has all of your inflation categories, and this is where I'll apply no inflation. Once you see a flat $40,000 in 2021, you can hit OK at the bottom of the screen. And now we do see that it varies. So any questions about what we've entered for the file? Yeah.
I'm having an issue with inflation. Basically, when we went to if you go to the inflation tab, my analysis started, my inputs started in January 2019 versus December 2018.
I'm sorry, say that again.
January 2019 in the first column versus
December 2018. So what in order to, this is all pulling from your analysis, when you start the analysis and the length of the analysis. So to change anything about when the analysis begins or how long it lasts, you need to go back to the Property Parent tab, Description sub-tab, and make sure that you begin your analysis in January of 2018. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just want to know, is there an undo button?
There is not an undo in Argus Enterprise.
Okay.
Yes. And speaking of that, we need to save our property. So we haven't saved anything we've done at this point. I'm going up to my home ribbon to save the property. And we're going to look at a cash flow to see what we've got within the system so far. So you have a cash flow on page 30. And to get there within our system, you can either use your home ribbon show hide buttons. I will use F3 to get there. To find your property level cash flow, we're looking for the Property Reports Parent tab. And your cash flow is the very first sub-tab. So let's talk about what we see here. First of all, underneath rental revenue, I have no income, and that's because we have no tenants entered in the building at this point. Moving down underneath other revenue, I'm going to see the roof antenna. So that's the miscellaneous revenue item that we entered, $12,000, inflating at our general inflation rate of 3% each year. That is the only revenue item being used to calculate our potential gross revenue and our effective gross revenue. Beneath the EGR, you'll see the operating expenses. So we've got insurance at $60,000, inflating at the expense inflation rate of 3%. Utilities is only showing us half of the full expense amount because it is 50% fixed and we are 0% occupied. It is also inflating at the 3% inflation rate. Then we see real estate taxes. We're getting the annual total here. Even though we entered that, breakdown, half in June, half in December, if you break the report down on a monthly basis, then you can see specifically when your payments are made. So we will talk about how to change your reporting frequency. Then our management fee showing at $360, it is a very tiny number because it is calculating as 3% of the effective gross revenue. Underneath our total operating expenses, we then see our NOI. We're all negative across all years. Things are not looking good here. So, we'll enter a tenant and hopefully things will start looking better. Beneath the NOI, we have our capital expenditures. First, we have our reserve, 10 cents per rentable area times 60,000 square, then inflating at our expense inflation rate, and our roof repair coming in at a flat 40 in year 4. So as we are working, your goal is to tie with the reports within your manual or what's up on my screen. And if you notice at any point that you are not matching, remember that we cannot stop everything to troubleshoot one file in particular, right? So there's a lot of you in here. If you find that you have hit a roadblock or a stumbling block somewhere along the way, please catch me on a break. I am happy to help you troubleshoot. Again, my name is Jess. So, I will do whatever I can to get your file straight, but just please seek me out. We can't stop everything in order to get your file straight. I'll go ahead and turn over to page 33. And this is actually a perfect point for us to stop and take a break. So we're going to come back and talk about our rent roll. We are going to take, we're doing really good on time, guys, so let's take 15 minutes. We will meet back here at 4:40, and I'm going to get started pretty promptly. I know there's a lot of us in here, but we have a lot of material to cover, okay? So please try and be respectful of everybody. Come back on time. I will see you guys at 4:40. Thank you.